At one point, and this is very important, during the conversation where Jamie, who is Martin Bryant, had been identified as Martin Bryant, was talking amiably with Terry McCarthy, there were 20 gunshots heard in the background. Someone else was firing from the cottage. The police tried to explain this away as coughs in the transcript. They were independently verified as being shots from an SKS semi-automatic rifle. Someone else was in the cottage shooting, whilst Martin was literally on the phone saying, I'm making a cup of tea for the hostages and I'm going to go, they've got some eggs and salad here and he was having this conversation. You very clearly hear gunshots in the background. So the notion, going back to identity and the Volvo and the passport, at some point, Jamie wouldn't tell the negotiator his name, but he rattled off his passport number. And he said, I know it so well because I've done lots of traveling. Lo and behold, they find the passport.
The Codega is a guide and a storyteller, escorting you through the night, lighting the way, warding off thieves, ghosts, demons, and other oddities. Along the journey, his companions would often share with him the most curious of stories that he'd record in his Codex. Perhaps you just might find yourself traveling with the Codega and sharing one of yours. Good evening and welcome back to another episode of Codex of Curiosities, where we dive into stories that so a lot of times just get overlooked, missed, or you haven't even heard about. One of those ones is the Port Arthur Massacre. Now, this happened in Australia, and now this is something that I really didn't know much about until about 3 months ago. I stumbled upon it, and I was like, this seems awfully peculiar. Now, the reason why I say that is because there are so many holes in the mainstream narrative that you could drive a tank through this. So many things don't line up. And so many coincidences happened on this day that it is impossible for all those coincidences to happen without it being orchestrated, without being more than what we really do know. I have a great documentarian coming on, Paul Motor, who has gone so deep into this subject. You know, he wanted to produce a film about it, about the murders and everything that happened. But it ended up being much more than he bargained for. He ended up realizing that this story, it doesn't line up. Nothing adds up on the story. So if you're interested in a real mind-messing story, now you'll see that there's a lot of similarities between what has happened in this incident in comparison to other incidents that you'll find in the U.S. And it's for you to piece it together and figure this out. Now, there is no disrespect to I want to be adamant about this. People lost their lives. Children lost their lives. This is a tragedy. But should we be overlooking the truth just because of a tragedy? Or should we give these people the true justice that they deserve? And by digging for the truth, that's what we all got to do. We have to dig for the truth, discover it, and don't take my word for it. Do your own research. Start asking questions. We all have to ask questions. And with that, let's jump into the interview. I'm extremely happy to have you on here because we are tackling the Port Arthur Massacre. This is something that I didn't know too much about until recently, and I'm giving myself too much credit. I don't even know that much about it. You know, I heard and I read a little bit, and then I stumbled upon your YouTube channel and your Instagram, the Wasp Files, and you know, you have a plethora of information, and this seems to have all the trademarks. You know, it kind of follows the same act that we've seen here in North America, where it's these staged false flags. And don't get me wrong, people were killed, people were murdered, but it's not what this narrative, it's not this story that they presented to us. It's something else completely different. And I I know that you know way more than just about anybody else out there. So who not better than you to tell us exactly about that? So I'd love for you to, first of all, introduce yourself, Paul, and then jump into what the Port Arthur Massacre was, when it happened, and the ramifications, the story that we're told, and all the, I don't want to say, and all the holes within that mainstream story.
Yeah, firstly, thank you very much for having me on the program. One of the things I like to start off by saying is that I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. In fact, I despise that term. I think there are better, more appropriate appellations to use, such as an enlightened thinker or a questioning mind. And rather than conspiracy theory, I use the term alternative narrative. Historically, the term conspiracy theorist has been around since the 1900s, but it certainly was brought to the fore specifically by the CIA to discredit anybody questioning the Warren report regarding the JFK assassination. So the CIA very effectively used that moniker to be able to discredit anyone that has the courage and the guts to ask questions. And I was always brought up to question, not just to blindly accept things. There's nothing wrong with asking questions, particularly in the absence of information. So a little bit of background about the Port Arthur Massacre. It did occur quite a while ago, 29 years ago, in 1996. The most astounding aspect of this was that at the time, this was the biggest mass killing by a lone gunman in world history. And it didn't take place in America. It took place in a sleepy little tourist site, which was a historical penal colony down in Tasmania at the farthest end of Australia, where a young man went into the tourist site with high-powered semi-automatic rifles and opened fire on the civilian population and killed 35 men, women, and children and injured 28 others. So it was a catastrophic, shocking event that had never been, there was no precedent to that, even in America at the time. My involvement with it was that I am a writer and a filmmaker, and I was looking to develop a project, in essence, a feature film based on some kind of event in Australian history, and no one had really touched the Port Arthur Massacre. It's a very grim and off-topic event down here in Australia. Even now, the controversy is heated, nearly 30 years later. And like all good filmmakers, I thought, I want to do a film about what everybody else knew, which was that a young man at the age of 29 years old, Martin Bryant, went down to Port Arthur and shot up the place and killed a lot of people, and then was convicted of the crime. I began to research the event, and the deeper I dug, the more I just had questions and said, this doesn't add up. So I've since then, for 9 years, I have dug very, very deeply into the Port Arthur Massacre, not just what I've read online and what's been espoused by various other alternative thinkers, but I've spoken firsthand to the police, first responders, victims, survivors, their families, people who knew Martin Bryant, who went to prison with him. Two of my good friends are direct survivors from Port Arthur, one of whom took a bullet in the throat on the day and survived remarkably. And these people have a different story to the mainstream narrative, and that sent me on my path of creating the Wasp Files.
All right, so that is how you got started. Was you're going to jump on a story that that isn't, well, it's controversial, but hasn't gotten its full publicity, as in not publicity as in TV, but you're going to do a documentary on it. And as you dug deeper, things started to unravel, which always seems to be the case. Now, this is something, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is something that always seems to happen, that when you start to dig in this, you get that famous line of, "Oh, you should respect the people that were killed. Stop doing this. Stop doing that. You're hurting the victims and the survivors of these." But I beg to differ. I think actually the truth is what they would want. The actual truth is what, if I was a victim, I wouldn't want some made up story placed over top of me. I would want the damn truth. And I feel that this is something that just that this narrative keeps getting thrown out. But correct me if I'm wrong, and please go on with this story, because the implications of this massacre, as well as I kind of mentioned, were very severe too.
Look, where do I start? One of the things to educate people on is that, as I said, this was the biggest mass killing by a lone gunman in world history. By law, by state law in our country, it should have mandated a coronial inquest, which is a thorough, detailed, in-depth examination of the circumstances of the crime. We also have a royal commission because we're part of the Commonwealth, which is also a public inquiry. And generally speaking, when they have a perpetrator, there is an open trial. We had none of those. So the biggest mass killing in Australian history had no open trial, no coronial inquest where evidence could be presented in court, hard evidence where witnesses could give their statements, where Martin Bryant could be cross-examined. None of that occurred. All the forensics, the ballistics had been locked down. And basically the only thing that put Martin Bryant in jail for consecutive life terms was a confession that he had presented. And then they said, okay, confession, he's pled guilty, no need for a trial, and he's sentenced to jail for the rest of his life. And we have no conflicting evidence, or what they call exculpatory evidence, presented to dispute that. There are some very specific circumstances regarding the circumstances of Martin Bryant's alleged confession. I have, as I said, dug very deeply. I have credible evidence from multiple sources that Martin Bryant, who was arrested at the tail end of the shooting, was held in solitary confinement in Risdon Prison, and that there was a deliberate agenda to torture his confession out of him. And I don't mean mistreatment, I mean torture. A protracted, sustained and deliberate campaign, because he held a not guilty plea staunchly for 5 months whilst kept mainly in solitary confinement, and that he was certainly cut off from any access to information, and that he was tortured by a cadre of very experienced guards, some of which had military backgrounds and employed military techniques. This, of course, has to be determined, and I have been fighting to get some investigation into that. Martin Bryant had a defence lawyer, and I'll use that term very loosely, because his defence lawyer was anything but. After the 5 months, John Avery, who was Martin Bryant's defence lawyer, went to his mother and said, look, you've got to get your son to change his plea to guilty. So he manipulated her into going to the prison, and his mother, who confessed this in her book, My Story, said that she said to Martin, unless you change your plea to guilty, you'll never see me or your sister Lindy again. Once again, it casts aspersions on the guilty plea. So after the supposed confession and guilty plea, Martin was given a sentencing trial and sent to prison. And to this day, 29 years later, no one has been able to interview this person to get the words straight from his mouth. No journalist. All the mainstream media in Australia have been very quick to demonise Martin Bryant. He was the perpetrator. They've totally ignored any of the ton of evidence that contradicts the mainstream story, and he is the poster boy for evil in Australia, but not one of them has interviewed him in 29 years. So he has been locked away. The evidence, the hard evidence, the ballistics, the forensics, the fingerprints, everything that could comprehensively prove beyond reasonable doubt in a court of law the guilt or innocence of the party involved has been locked down, initially with a Hobart Supreme Court ban of 30 years. And then in 2016, a decision was made to digitise the entire data resource on Port Arthur Massacre and put it under the highest restrictive category, Chief Police Commissioner's eyes only for a further 75 years. So none of this evidence will be released until 2091. By then, you, me, and everyone associated with Port Arthur will be dead. So that is...
Yeah, exactly. And now, sorry, I have a question, Paul, about Martin. One thing I did read is that his IQ level, he was operating at a very low IQ level, and his mentality was like close to that of a 11-year-old or something like that.
That's correct. That's another misnomer with the judicial process that was applied with the Port Arthur Massacre. Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66, which makes him the equivalent of an 11-year-old child. He had distinctive physiological and psychological disadvantages, you could say, and challenges. And he was placed on a guardianship order by the Hobart Supreme Court in 1993, 3 years before the Port Arthur Massacre, rendering him mentally incapable of handling his affairs. So there were a lot of problems with some of the investigative processes. He was, for instance, interviewed by 2 police officers without legal counsel present, even though he asked, should I have my lawyer here? And was told, oh, he knows. Nor did he have a legal guardian. So in essence, this was a man with a diminished mental IQ and certainly a lot of psychological issues and almost like a childlike innocence and gullibility, who was convicted without trial and thrown in jail for the rest of his life. Now, Martin Bryant was arrested at the later aspect of the shooting, which was a siege that took place at a bed and breakfast cottage. However, my investigations, and anyone who wants to dig deep and look at the Wasp Files will find that there is no hard evidence linking him to the majority of the shooting which took place at the Port Arthur historical site itself. And in essence, nobody was killed during the later part of the siege. It's very complex, but the notion was that he was set up as the classic patsy, lured to a location and kept there, and basically a professional and psychopathic killer was sent in to undertake the massacre that took place at the historic site, who then made their way back to the cottage where Martin was kept, and then he was drugged and then left to die, and the place was set alight. Martin Bryant, however, did not burn to death. He woke on fire and ran from the building and was arrested by the Special Operations Group police, quote, grinning and out with the fairies. So there is a lot of, to this day, Martin, in the only interview he did with police, has never admitted to killing anyone. On multiple occasions, he said, I was never at Port Arthur. He has a confused recollection of kidnapping somebody at gunpoint. But in essence, there needs to be a much more thorough, detailed examination of the facts and a presentation of the hard evidence, the ballistics, the fingerprints that were on the casings and the discarded firearm magazine. All of that has never seen the light of day. There are so many questions with Port Arthur that I found myself on this journey. As I said, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not an activist. I'm not a crusader. I'm not here to trivialize Port Arthur or sensationalize Bryant. But we have some very, very serious questions about this event. And to this day, it's a lockdown. No one can get the answers they need.
This sounds like it sounds like a terrible movie almost, in a way, like the way that this is all orchestrated and how it's all worked out. It sounds like he was supposed to die, but he didn't. Wow, this is incredible. They had their patsy, they had this guy. Now you said, let's go into the actual Port Arthur Massacre. I'd like to go into that. I'd like you to walk us through what happened. And for those who are listening or watching this, I'm going to give you like a viewer discretion in advance, because I'm sure there's going to be some details here that maybe a bit disturbing.
Yeah. So as I said, it happened 29 years ago in 1990. a wonderfully antiquated historical tourist site down in Tasmania, which is a little island off the mainstream of Australia. The Port Arthur historic site was the site of the original convict settlement, where a lot of people were sent from England and from Australia, and it was a horrendous place to be interned as a prisoner. There was a lot of brutality. And many decades later, it's become a historical site that is visited by people from all over the world. So on Sunday, the 28th of April, 1996, on a nice little sunny day down in Tasmania, a gentleman walked into a cafe with the equivalent of an AR-15 rifle, which was actually a civilian version known as the Colt SP1. Contrary to popular belief, AR does not stand for assault rifle. It stands for Armalite rifle. And it is a civilian rifle, even though it has the same configuration as the classic M16 rifle that was used predominantly during the Vietnam War. This is a semi-automatic rifle. It doesn't have select fire and fire fully automatic weapons. Fully automatic rate of fire. It has a cyclopedic stock, which can be withdrawn to give the firearm more accuracy when shooting from the shoulder. The rifle that was used ostensibly was, in essence, identical to this. It had a scope on the top and contained a 30-round magazine. It was one of 3 firearms which were utilised at the Port Arthur Massacre. So a bit of history in regards to that. In 1996, firearm laws were reasonably loose. You still required to have a licence and to be a fit and proper person. As early as 1991, certain states in Australia had much loose gun laws. So Tasmania was renowned for having fairly loose gun laws where you could purchase high-powered semi-automatic rifles. Same with Queensland. There was an attempt as early as 1991 by the federal government to impose a nationwide regulation of firearms, and all of the states were balking at this. Our New South Wales Premier in 1987, Barry Unsworth, was famously quoted as saying, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until there's a massacre in Tasmania." Lo and behold, not too long after, a massacre in Tasmania. Famous anti-gun advocate Roland Brown also stated there will be a massacre in Tasmania. This all happened before Port Arthur. So a gentleman went into the tourist site, drove down through the toll booth, and tried to park near the water's edge. And the intended target was a ferry that would contain tourists that would go across to a little historical island called the Isle of the Dead. The Isle of the Dead had old gravestones, and it was a little island just off the mainland of Tasmania. On board that ferry that day would have been approximately 80 US tourists. There was, however, a bit of a glitch where they had changed the schedule of the ferry. So the gunman had parked down near the water's edge and tried to get onto the ferry. But it had left half an hour earlier. So there was a change of plans, and the gunman went into a crowded cafe called the Broad Arrow Cafe, where people were eating their lunch, where staff members were on site, and opened fire. In a very short amount of time, within the confines of that cafeteria, he killed about 20 people. There was an enormous controversy because this was a government-run site, and there was a fire exit door. 6 people lost their lives directly because the fire exit door had been nailed shut. The survivors, and particularly the Port Arthur employees who lost loved ones on the day, were outraged and were adamant in calling for a coronial inquest once again, if only to examine why a fire exit door, a crucial aspect of a government-run site or any site, was nailed shut. There was an attempted cover-up where they said the lock was inoperable, but that was proven to be false, and it was later found that a local maintenance person had nailed the door shut to prevent people from shoplifting from the cafeteria. However, 6 people died crowded trying to get out through the fire exit door and was shot down mercilessly. The gunman then exited the cafe and made his way towards the buses, firing indiscriminately in the local exterior area. And a lot of people thought that it was a historical reenactment, that there were muskets being fired. So people didn't know what was going on, and they were approaching the site thinking it was a reenactment. The gunman killed people on and around the tourist buses. He then took his vehicle and exited the Port Arthur site, stopping along the way on the exit road, and he murdered a young mother and her 2 children. Nanette was the mother, and her 2 daughters, Alana and Madeline, who were 6 and 3, and he shot them down. One of the little girls tried to run around a tree to escape, and he chased her around the tree and shot her dead. He then drove the vehicle to the toll booth, and there was an unusual altercation there where he'd had some interaction with some people in another vehicle before shooting 4 people there and commandeering their vehicle. He then drove this vehicle out to a service station, kidnapped a couple, shot the woman in the car, but then took her boyfriend and put him in the boot of the car, made his way back to a little bed and breakfast called Seascape Cottage, where a siege then was undertaken throughout the evening and early into the next morning, when the cottage burnt down and Martin Bryant ran out on fire and was arrested by the police. That, in essence, was the scale, the breathtaking scale of the assault that took place at the Port Arthur site and the surrounding areas. And as I stated, 35 men, women and children murdered, 28 people injured, and it was the biggest mass shooting at the time. It sent shockwaves throughout Australia and around the world. The weapons that were used was, as shown before, was the Colt SP1 semi-automatic rifle, which fires, in essence, a .223 caliber round. Fairly well known in the States because we know the AR-15 uses a .223, and there have been quite an amount of mass shootings using this particular type of caliber and variant of firearm. At some point, the shooter also used an older firearm known as an L1A1 or self-loading rifle, which used a much higher caliber, which was the 308, or the military version, which is 7.62 by 51. It's obviously much larger than the .223, has a greater range and certainly a lot more damage when it is used against people. So there were 2 rifles that were fired. There was a semi-automatic Daewoo shotgun with a 10-round magazine that was discovered in the boot of the car. There were strong indications that in the cafeteria the shotgun was fired, that there were victims with pallet damage, clear pallet damage. However, the ballistic expert who had done an examination of the site omitted any firing of a shotgun, strangely. And there was some questions about why there was no mention of pallet damage. One of the surgeons at the Hobart Hospital, Dr. Wilkinson, had stated that everywhere we looked, we found pallets. There's a big difference between pallets and shrapnel that's caused by the shredding of, copper casings from rounds. So it's one of many, many discrepancies and anomalies that have not had a thorough, detailed investigation. Same with the guns. There is a lot of question as to where those guns came from, how they made their way to Tasmania and into the arms of someone who would then use them against the civilian population. Martin Bryant did not have a gun license, nor did he have a driver's license. And yet he was supposedly in possession of these high-powered semi-automatic weapons. Where else can I go? There's so much to talk about. It's such a huge event.
Yeah, I know there's like so many different avenues that we could go. Like, I don't know. There's so many discrepancies. I don't want to say discrepancies, just coincidences. Actually, that might be a better word. Like the purchasing of the morgue truck. Them predicting, like you said, like the governor's predicting that, or the premier's predicting that there's going to be some sort of action happening in Tasmania. The police taking so long to show up as well. I would love for you to just to dive into, like, start breaking these down. Like,
Sure.
this happened, and this is strange. This happened, and this is strange.
Let's talk about the coincidences. So to give you some idea, there was some precedent to gun control and massacres. In 1987, in the state of Victoria, there were two massacres. One was known as the Hoddle Street shooting, and the other was known as the Queen Street shooting, where once again we had two lone gunmen who had taken high-powered semi-automatic rifles and opened up on the civilian population. As a result of those shootings, the Victorian Premier at the time, John Cain, had implemented a ban on high-powered semi-automatic rifles. This could certainly have then been considered as a precedent for why the federal government said, well, we want to have uniform gun laws because they're all disparate throughout the states. Lo and behold, we had the Port Arthur Massacre. As a result of the Port Arthur Massacre itself, our then newly elected Prime Minister, John Howard, who'd only been in the job for about 2 months just prior to Port Arthur, though he was also instrumental in drafting legislation to ban semi-automatic high-powered rifles and pump-action shotguns and the like as early as 1991. So this information was drafted federally. Constitutionally, federal laws cannot overturn state laws. That's why they were trying to get a uniform gun ban. After Port Arthur, our Prime Minister was then lauded as the man who got it done, who then forced all of the states into a uniform ban on high-powered semi-automatic rifles and pump-action shotguns and even semi-automatic 22 rifles, rabbit rifles for people who may not know. So we had the most extensive gun control legislation introduced very quickly after Port Arthur, and there was a gun buyback in which quite a lot of firearms were removed from society that were, considered to be something that civilian populations should not own or hold. As a historical aspect to gun control in Australia, gun homicide was on the decline before Port Arthur. It was not going up. Yes, we had the massacres, which caused the shock. But since then, and since the gun bans, there are more firearms in Australia than there was before Port Arthur. So we can no longer own high-powered semi-automatic rifles. Well, you can, but they're very, very heavily restricted, very certain circumstances. Pump-action shotguns you cannot own. Semi-automatic 22s you cannot own. You can, however, have handgun licenses that include semi-automatic handguns. And there is some sophisticated firearms now like straight pull shotguns. You can own pump-action high-powered rifles, just not semi-automatic rifles. To give you some context on the hysteria that is presented by the authorities and the media in relation to gun crime in Australia. In 2000, there's an estimated 4 million registered firearms in Australia out of a population of 28 million. The media are quick to decry that there is also anywhere between 350,000 to 1 million unregistered firearms in Australia. If you put that together, that's a total of nearly 5 million guns. That's a lot of guns in a population of 28 million. So the question has to be asked, why aren't we being shot in droves? We have gun crime, but in 2023, the homicide rate was 247. Of those, 27 were gun-related. And of those, the majority were criminals using guns against other criminals. We do not have a gun problem in Australia. We have a media hysteria problem. I don't have a problem with sensible gun control. We have some of the strictest gun control laws in the world. You have to lock the ammunition separately. You can't store them together. You have to have a safe. You have to have your fingerprints taken, all of that stuff. That's fine. But there is just an agenda. There is an agenda to remove firearms from the world population, and certainly Australia was a test case for that. So that's to dive into the coincidences. As I said, there's so much to talk about, so I'm just going to ramble. People often say they use the defense of Occam's razor. They can say, look, you can try and be a conspiracy theorist, but the logical determination of events is due to that notion of Occam's razor, that the most simple solution is the one. My answer to that is synchronicity. When you have coincidences, you can say, oh, there's a coincidence. When you have a multitude, and I mean a multitude of coincidences, one after the other, that seem to suggest an alternative determination, then you have synchronicity, which is the likelihood that there is another determination. So to quickly go through some of those, we spoke about the politicians who were proclaiming that there would be a massacre in Tasmania prior to. Could have just been, them thinking out loud. The infamous morgue truck, which you mentioned before, was a 22-person refrigerated morgue truck designed to transport bodies in Tasmania. At the time that it was commissioned and built for the state government, people were incredulous. They were like, why do we need this? Tasmania is lucky if we have 3 or 4 deaths a year. Victoria and New South Wales, which have much higher death rates, don't have such a vehicle. So this morgue truck was built and commissioned, and lo and behold, when Port Arthur erupted, there was conveniently a large refrigerated morgue truck to be able to transport the bodies to the state coroners. You would think that they would then hang on to that vehicle afterwards and say, well, it was very valuable, thank God we had it. That was not the case. It was sold by an ex-Special Operations Group police officer, Chris Wright, as the vehicle that was used at Port Arthur. To this day, it's disappeared. No one knows what happened to it. Some other coincidences. At the time in Tasmania, there was a conference that was held for trauma surgeons from all over Australia, dealing specifically with being able to deal with trauma, mass trauma, an influx of mass trauma victims. So they were there in Hobart on the day. So when there was a need suddenly for trauma surgeons to deal with mass trauma, there was a huge amount of them conveniently in Hobart. Media. There was a media conference in Hobart with over 700 journalists from all over the world. So it was like, we need media to cover this event. They were bussed in by the truckload. 700 journalists who were literally escorted on to cover the event. The Hobart Hospital itself had just implemented a Code Brown, literally in the days before Port Arthur. Code Brown is the hospital protocol for dealing with an influx of mass trauma victims. So very conveniently and luckily, they had a Code Brown where they were able to have a system in place ready to deal with an influx of dozens of victims, which is what they had. Other coincidences was that the only 2 police officers close to the Port Arthur historic site, whose job it was to close a swing bridge that connected the site to the mainland in the event of emergency, were lured away by a phone call where there was a report of drugs that was stashed on the other side of the island, 30 minutes away. So the 2 police officers went over to investigate, found a jar of soap powder. While they were over there, bang, 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 the shooting took place at the Port Arthur historic site. Never been determined who made that call. Pretty clever for someone who was had an IQ of 66 to lure the only 2 police officers away. So there were many, many more coincidences. There was also some refrigerated storage boxes to store cadavers, in essence, and this was This was convened and manufactured, and the coroner at the time from the Melbourne group that had constructed these boxes had put out a statement saying that they were particularly impressed with the Nelson brothers for constructing these refrigerated cadaver boxes ready for the incident. That person's name was Stephen Parry, and people raised eyebrows and said, "It's an unusual thing for you to say."
That is an extremely unusual thing to say. When when you look at these things and you have like just one, like let's say they, like you said, they did the code brown, and if it was only that, you could be like, wow, that was pretty serendipitous that we were prepared for that. But when you just keep adding them up and adding them up, all concerning this one incident in this one location, it's there is something crazy going on. And if you could go into the police as well, like they were like 6 hour delay because they're at a barbecue or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that was another outrageous event where the shooting took place at approximately 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon. And if you can imagine the carnage inside the Broad Arrow Cafe where 20 people had been shot with a high-powered rifle. A lot of the survivors and the Port Arthur employees were trying to deal with this situation of hundreds of panicked tourists to provide triage and emergency care for hours. The police had converged on force from the mainland of Australia. They sent in Special Operations Group police. There were water police. And rather than come into Port Arthur, they were kept at a nearby site called Turana. And ostensibly they were told it's too dangerous to go in, even though there was Special Operations Group police there. They were kept there for 6 hours. And yes, they had a barbecue. So the poor people that were at the Port Arthur site who were in a panic mode trying to deal with this were left alone for hours. There was no containment of the crime scene. People were traipsing all throughout the crime scenes. In some cases, people were souveniring bullet casings off the ground. The carnage, a very outspoken and adamant and courageous young woman by the name of Wendy Skua, who was a Port Arthur employee, was performing triage on the victims covered in blood and just yelling, "Where's the help? Where is the ambulances? Where are the police?" Some hours later, a helicopter landed and there were two unarmed constables who were the first police on the site. They were just converged upon by people in horror and panic, and they were trying to control this situation. So something like 6 hours later, the police roll in armed to the teeth. But by then, the trauma that was done to the survivors was astronomical. And then it was discovered that the siege had commenced at the bed and breakfast cottage some kilometres away from Port Arthur, and the police had surrounded that property. But it was a monstrous failure on the part of the police in terms of providing that initial forceful response. As we know in the States, when there's an active shooter, the edict is for police to go in hard and fast straight away and engage the shooter. We didn't have that.
This reminds me a little bit of Olvedi, the school shooting, where the police stayed outside. They were too scared, and parents were trying to get into, like, get out of my way, I'll go in kind of thing. This has a lot of, it's very reminiscent of that as well. It's like, oh, we're scared. We don't want to go in. But this is your job. This is what you signed up for.
Yeah, I mean, I've studied a lot of those shootings, and I'm certainly aware of that particular shooting. And, there was a lot of shall we say, reassessment and reevaluation of police tactics in regards to active shooters after Uvalde. I mean, it was a catastrophic loss of life, and they should have gone in. They had body armor, they're armed, they're trained, they have ballistic shields, and that can prevent these things. They often say a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun. Interestingly, with Port Arthur, there was a member of the public who had witnessed the shooting at the servery where he'd kidnapped the person and shot his girlfriend. And he was running around. He had a .22 rifle, but he had the ammunition stored separately. He was trying to protect his family, and he had the notion that he could have intercepted the gunman. But by the time he got the ammunition and got the firearm and loaded, it was too late. With just a bit of an aside to the criticism that's often labelled at America in relation to their gun control, which I vigorously defend, because America is a totally different scenario to Australia. America has a constitutional right to keep and bear arms and to have a civilian militia in the event of a tyrannical government, in part because America had a civil war. Australia does not have a constitutional right to own firearms. We have a privilege. That privilege can be taken away at any point, and we do not have a right to use firearms for self-defense at all. There have been cases here where the crime is very much out of control at the moment. We have a lot of home invasions and carjackings, violent, with armed offenders. But if you dare to use any kind of weapon, particularly a firearm, you'll very quickly find yourself charged. I also know that when you consider gun homicides in America, something like 80% of gun homicides are related to African-American crime, gang crime. Not to be, point a racial finger. It's simply to state that if you remove that aspect from the gun statistics, and also things like suicides and accidental deaths, given the population of America, it puts some context on the notion of the firearm homicide rate. Yes, of course, mass shootings are a monstrous and horrific anomaly, but I'm one of those people that says we really need to ask why. Why some 18-year-old kid or somebody that's a trans kid will pick up a firearm and turn it on their fellow classmates. There are some much deeper sociological aspects of society that have been not examined thoroughly enough. It's too easy to blame the gun.
And personally, one thing that is not being dived into concerning these mass shootings is the use of pharmaceuticals. SRIs, I believe they are, which are like antipsychotics. If we looked into this, well, I do know the statistic that I believe it is 100% of all mass shootings these individuals have been taking these antipsychotics, which begs to differ. It's like, okay, so we have something that is consistent throughout. Why don't we look in there? But of course, we better not look there at all. That's what they want you to believe.
I'm very glad you brought that up. I've looked into all of those shootings going back as far as Charles Whitman, the Texas Tower sniper, and you're dead right. All of those people, I was looking for a common denominator, specifically with these young mass school shooters and mall shooters, and I think I found them. Generally speaking, they were Anglo-Saxons, they were white, they came from reasonably good homes. They had some minor issues, whether it was anxiety or a bit of peer group pressure or some bullying. They had a few minor issues. And then, of course, the aspect was that rather than get counselling and, evaluation for their conditions, they were prescribed these very, very dangerous and reckless antipsychotic and antidepressant medication. And if you dig into the side effects of those, in the initial stages of taking them, they can cause homicidal, suicidal urges and reckless behavior. So these kids they've got a few issues. They get isolated. They get lonely. They sort of pull back from society to a certain extent. They are prescribed this medication. That loneliness turns to anger. And then, of course, they do have access to firearms. And then you've got a ticking time bomb. But there is certainly, and I'll say this 100%, fingers need to be pointed at big pharmaceuticals companies for the rampant increase in the prescription of these drugs. Prior to 1988, there were virtually no mass shootings in America. What happened in 1988, prescription of antipsychotic medication went up 400%. So there is a smoking gun, and it isn't the gun.
No, it isn't. And I just actually sat down with a psychotherapist, Jerry Marzinski, who goes into quite details about SSRIs or SSRI. Sorry, please correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But he goes into quite a lot of detail about them. And yes, they are. One of the side effects is clearly suicidal tendencies and homicidal tendencies as well. And not only that, these drugs are meant to be taken in short amounts of time, but of course they're not. They are prescribed for lifetimes, and it is causing so much detrimental issues. And we've seen it. We literally have seen it. 100% of these shooters have been on one of these medications. And of course, we're just not going to look there. We won't look there. I do want to circle back to the Port Arthur shooting with Martin there. I would like to now kind of go into witnesses. What did the witnesses see? Because, I do believe Martin was involved, but I don't think he was a lone gunman.
Yeah, I have virtually all of the witness statements. There is something like 400 of them. As I said, I've dug very deeply. What we have is a lot of contradictions where most people saw a young man in a dark coat with this very distinctive, long, surfy blonde hair. So most of the witness statements said that was the gunman. And in essence, the gunman had driven onto the Port Arthur historical site in a very distinctive yellow Volvo sedan with a surfboard bolted to the roof of the vehicle. When that vehicle was later on discovered abandoned at the toll booth, once the shooter had commandeered another vehicle and shot the occupants, Martin Bryant's passport was discovered in the glove box of the Volvo, hence linking him to the crime. However, we have some witnesses that one of the issues is that most of the people that witnessed Martin Bryant didn't know Martin Bryant. All they saw was a young man in a coat with long blonde hair. Conversely, there were people that did know Martin Bryant because he was a local figure who had grown up with him, knew him from when he was a child, who were there on the day, who stated that the shooter was not Martin Bryant. They have never been given their say in court, nor been interviewed by the media, because their stories contradict the mainstream narrative. I have two very good friends who were survivors from Port Arthur, one of them whom took a bullet in the throat, as I stated. Remarkable man. And he lay on the ground pretending to be dead and watched the shooter the entire time. He also stated that and this is in a witness statement, that he had watched the shooter enter the cafe. He told me that he seemed to be in the presence of two other individuals. His impression was they came as a group, that they went around, separated, that the person with the long blonde hair did a traverse at the cafe, came back in, started shooting, and shot my friend. And he stated categorically the person was not Martin Bryant, that he had a pockmarked, acne-scarred face and worker's hands, and Martin Bryant was renowned for having very smooth skin. There were many other witnesses who knew Martin Bryant that saw him on the day, even on the way down to the Port Arthur site, who said, I didn't recognise the person as being Martin Bryant. These people never got their say in court. The other issue is that some of the witnesses, we do know that, of course, during traumatic events, people can have different, they can be shocked and they can have different recollections as to the accuracy of statements. But they should have been called for an open trial to give their testimony. And because there hasn't been a release in the court of law with the forensics, the DNA, the ballistics, one interesting aspect to the shooting was that the shooter who went into the Broad Arrow Cafe was witnessed, and this is in statements, with a video camera. And that video camera was set up on the table that the shooter had sat at prior to taking out the firearm and shooting people, ostensibly to video the event. Now, this was witnessed, and there is also photographic evidence in the aftermath where they scan across the table where you see the gun bag, and very clearly next to the bag is a video camera. You would imagine that whatever was on that video camera would comprehensively identify the shooter's identity. That has never seen the light of day. It's never been presented in court. Was there a tape? Who's on the tape? Who owned the camera? This was more evidence, crucial evidence, that has never been tendered that could identify the shooter. The ballistics expert, Gerard Dutton, who had convened the examination of the ballistics, was questioned as to whether there was any evidence linking Martin Bryant directly to the shootings at the cafe. Caused some consternation at the time, and the person was attempted to be evicted. He was asked the question again, and then he eventually stated there is no empirical evidence linking Martin Bryant to the Broad Arrow Cafe. This is the ballistic expert. So witnesses, yes, and some people saying it was definitely him, and I don't discount that. As I said, I'm here to ask questions and explore. Was Martin Bryant the shooter? Could very well have been. But if you sort of say beyond reasonable doubt in a court of law, we don't have that a surety. We just don't. And I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about what people saw, who they saw. There were different descriptions of other shooters with different coloured hair, all sorts of things. At the Seascape Cottage, which was where the siege took place, 2 police officers who both tendered statements saying that they saw a naked, dark-haired person running between the buildings. One of them thought that person was female. It's never been identified who that person was. The owners of the cottage, which were an elderly couple, David and Sally Martin, were ostensibly murdered prior to Port Arthur. And they were found in the burnt remains of the building. So the story was that prior to Port Arthur, the shooter had gone to Broad Arrow Cafe, murdered the couple, and driven the Volvo into the site. So going back to what you said about the identity and the witnesses, so what we do have is Martin Bryant's Volvo, Martin Bryant's supposedly owned firearms, his passport. But there were some very interesting interactions that took place during the siege. There was a police negotiator having a phone conversation with Terry McCarthy, who I've spoken to at length, Sergeant Terry McCarthy, who was the police negotiator. He said the conversation was weird. The person on the other end of the phone was calling themselves Jamie, was not identifying as Martin Bryant. He said he was acting in a strange manner, as though he was reading from a script. He was saying things like, "Oh, how are you, Jamie? Oh, I'm okay, like I'm on a Hawaiian holiday. Oh, I don't know what you mean by that. Oh, I don't know myself really either." Just odd sort of communications. At one point, and this is very important, during the conversation where Jamie, who is Martin Bryant, had been identified as Martin Bryant, was talking amiably with Terry McCarthy, there were 20 gunshots heard in the background. Someone else was firing from the cottage. The police tried to explain this away as coughs in the transcript. They were independently verified as being shots from an SKS semi-automatic rifle. Someone else was in the cottage shooting whilst Martin was literally on the phone saying, "Oh, I'm making a cup of tea for the hostages and I'm going to go and they've got some eggs and salad here and He was having this conversation. You very clearly hear gunshots in the background. So the notion, going back to identity and the Volvo and the passport, at some point, Jamie wouldn't tell the negotiator his name, but he rattled off his passport number. And he said, "Oh, I know it so well because I've done lots of traveling." Lo and behold, they find the passport. The alternative narrative, which I've examined in the Wasp Files, if it wasn't Martin Bryant, what was the scenario and who was the shooter? In essence, consider the notion that Martin was lured to the Seascape Cottage to take part in a counter-terrorism exercise, to play the role of Jamie, and that they sent in a professional with his Volvo, with his firearms, with a wig, to undertake the shooting. As far-fetched as that sounds, I filmed a trailer for the movie I wanted to do, which I still wish to do, called Wasp, the Port Arthur Massacre. And as an experiment, I had 2 different actors playing Martin Bryant. one of them obviously wearing a blonde wig. No one picked it up. So the notion was you can put a blonde wig on someone and everyone will just accept, oh, that's Martin Bryant. So, look, as I said, I'm scientifically minded. I've examined this. Could it have been Martin Bryant? Yes, it could have been. But we need the hard evidence. We need 100% to prove it. We need to hear from him. I've tried to speak to Martin Bryant. My letter to him was seized as a risk to prison security. I've sent another letter. They bin them. He doesn't get to talk to anybody. I've spoken to inmates that have spoken to him, and they all ask him, why did you do it? One of them told me that he agreed that he was involved, but he said, I didn't do Port Arthur. And when asked who did, he got very frightened, apparently, and said men in blue overalls. Take that for what you will, but this is a man that we need to hear from. This is a man who's been incarcerated and drugged and kept away from the public, locked down for 29 years. Charles Manson, Ed Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, the Unabomber, they all were able to give testimony. We were able to hear from their lips, not in Australia. This man is persona non grata. I can understand people being upset and saying we don't want to hear from this guy, but his identity as the shooter at Port Arthur, in my opinion, has not been determined.
Because the media has already painted the picture, and they've created this villain, and Australia hates this villain, and it's some people would rather just see him burn than hear anything. But that's what the media has done, and we know that the media has been weaponized as of I don't even say as of late. For the last 30, 40 years, the media has slowly become weaponized. And if we look at, I believe it's Operation Mockingbird by the CIA, where they infiltrate the media and take it over. They admitted to this. They never admitted to stopping it. The media has been taken over. We've lost investigative journalism. I remember when you used to watch 60 Minutes, and they did actually quality stuff, and they investigated stuff. Like W5 used to investigate stuff, and it was amazing. Now it's these fluff pieces that it's just we want to orchestrate how you think or what you think, and that is what's happening more and more with the media. And I just had to bring up a couple more things here. When you talked about the passport, I kind of chuckled a little bit. I laughed, and I don't mean to be disrespectful or anything, but I've seen this before. I've seen someone find a passport before. Was that 9/11 where they discovered passports? And look at here's our hijackers. It's too convenient. Yep. And you said for him to
pulverized. Things were pulverized into dust, but there's a passport.
Clear as day. We have the passport, and and then we can. That's exactly. There are patterns, and for him to rattle off his passport number. It's almost too obvious. It's terribly written. And I do want to talk about something. So I want to focus that he had the mentality, an IQ of 66, mentality of 11-year-old. But it sounds like these murders were lethal, like methodical, lethal, and with precision. How can someone who has an IQ of 66 be able to conduct some of these murders with such lethality?
Yeah, definitely. There is very distinct witness statements that contradict the nature of the shooter and the manner in which they carried out the massacre. And Martin Bryant's evidence challenges both psychological and physiological. Of course, a lot of people say, look, it's close range. It's like shooting fish in the proverbial barrel. I've been a shooter for many years. I know a lot about firearms. It's one thing to shoot targets. It's another thing to engage live people in an assault situation. So even though 20 people were taken in the cafe at very close ranges with the Colt SB1 or AR-15 equivalent, it's a remarkable feat for any one man to achieve. You've got the rush of adrenaline. You've got the unpredictable nature, the panic, the screaming, people doing what they're not supposed to do, people trying to intercept you, apprehend you, All of the witness statements stated that the shooter was calm, methodical. One of the witnesses, Neville Quinn, stated he was the best trained army man I've ever seen. His stance was unbelievable. There are a lot of reports that this shooter was very proficient with the use of those firearms, and Martin, conversely, was not. At one point, a person who supposedly was Martin Bryant went into a gun store with an AR-10, which is the .308 equivalent of the AR-15, and handed it over to the gun store owner, Terry Hills, and said, there's something wrong with this gun. And when the gun dealer ejected the magazine, he saw it was loaded, and then he was horrified to know that there was one up in the breech. The person had brought a locked and loaded AR-10 into a gun store and didn't know how to clear a breech or a magazine. Supposedly handed over a gun license in the name Martin Ryan, not Martin Bryant. So whether that was Martin or not with a fake license, I don't know. But by all reports, Martin Bryant was not proficient with firearms. And the scale of the massacre itself, you've got multiply staged events. And then you've got a pre-established siege location where there were many other firearms present as well that were used. The police officers that were decoyed away on the wild goose chase. Very, very clever for a person with an IQ of 66. During the shooting at the cafeteria, 30-round magazine was employed, but 29 shots were fired, and then the magazine was swapped over. It's a military tactic to always leave one in the breech in case someone tries to tackle you whilst you're engaging them. So you've got one ready to engage, and then you can slap in another magazine. There were a lot of tactics during the siege at Seascape where lights were being turned on and off in different parts of the building. Shots were being fired from different angles. Initial reports were that there was more than one shooter at the Seascape cottage from the police. And interestingly enough, the shooter was a person who, with impunity, murdered men, women, and young children. Once the shooting took place at Seascape, the police had surrounded the area and they were fired upon very accurately, but none of them were killed. At one point, Jamie, on the phone with police negotiator, had some kind of night vision device and said, "What I've noticed, man, is that one of your men is creeping up on the northeast corner. Can you tell him to move back because I can see his scope and I've got this laser scope here." He was warning the police to stay back. Why didn't he kill them? If he could see them at night, the SOGs converging on the building, Special Operations Group police. No police was shot. They were shot at very accurately. He had them pinned down, but nobody died. And instead of, employing that ruthless psychopathy against the police, nobody died. So these are, once again, coincidences and anomalies. Martin Bryant was certainly at Seascape Cottage. He was arrested there, but there are at one point he asked the police negotiator, "What's gone on at Port Arthur?" And the negotiator replied, "There's been people shot." And Martin's response was, "They weren't killed." Very odd thing for someone to say who, if they had been the person that had gone down there and killed 35 men, women, and children, you'd pretty much know what you did. Whether he was lying, omitting, once again, needs to be determined, but there are a lot of questions. Just to go back a little bit on the media, one of the reasons we didn't have a trial was the atrocious behaviour of the media. So Martin Bryant had undertaken the siege at Seascape Cottage, which was taking place overnight after the shooting at the site and into the next morning. The very next day, the media had broken into his house in Clare Street, Newtown, and stolen a photograph of Martin Bryant. The very next day, all of the main papers had that photograph on their front pages with titles like, "This is the man and the face of a killer." He hadn't even been charged. That is against the law. And they were slapped across the wrist. They just prejudiced an entire trial and determined the guilt of Martin Bryant. He hadn't even been charged. This was the morning after the siege. every major newspaper carried his photograph with his determination of guilt. Now that's unlawful, and of course would have prejudiced any trial. Some of the witnesses who said, "Oh, it was definitely Martin Bryant," then came out and said, "Well, we might have been influenced by the photo that we saw in the paper the next day." So the whole world suddenly knew that Martin Bryant was the man. Never had his chance to be cross-examined in court ever. So if you read the transcript, all of this information is available on the Wasp Files. The one transcript of the interview that he had with the two police officers was fraught with problems. There were technical glitches, stops and starts. Responses were inaudible. It was a mess. He had no legal guardian present. It should never have been permitted in court. The whole thing was just contradictory. And Martin was shown one of the rifles that was used during Port Arthur, and he said, "That's not one of mine. No, never seen that one before." Was he lying? He also demonstrated to the two police officers in the interview that he shot from the left hand. He was a left-hand rifle shooter. All of the witnesses stated that the shooter fired from the right hand and didn't really shoot much from the shoulder, but fired from the hip. So most of the killings that took place in the Port Arthur Cafe were headshots, and they were taken firing from the hip with the AR-15, which had a scope on the top. For people who don't know that rifle, it only ejects, the ejection port is only on the right-hand side. If you were a left-hand shooter and you were shooting an AR-15, you would have brass and gas and powder residue sort of emitting from that port. However, if you then switch to a right-handed hip shoot, you wouldn't have that issue. But still, the accuracy, mainly headshots. And all of the witnesses said he was a right-hand shooter shooting from the hip, and Martin was a left-hand shooter. So, once again, there's so much here. I could talk forever, and I know we have to wrap up at some point, but...
Of course. Now, like, Paul, we've seen this played out, like, different locations, but kind of the same... I don't want to say it's exactly the same, but we've seen, like, so many holes in the stories, things just not lining up, things not adding up, patsies, actors, things placed and where they shouldn't be. What do you think the purpose, the end goal of this is? I know you kind of mentioned, is possibly to remove all the guns from the population. Is that what you think it is, or is that just an ends? Is that just part of the process into something else much more vile?
I'm glad you asked that question. A lot of people comment on the Wasp Files saying, it was done for gun control to disarm us. Now, we do know we have more firearms in Australia than before Port Arthur, so that's not really successful. But philosophically, I've always replied and said, gun control alone is far too simple a motive. Anyone who studies history, and you should if you don't, going back through centuries, the oldest motivators in the book: power, money, influence, and control. There is always people that benefit from things such as 9/11, whether it's the insurance policies that were taken out on the building. There is the control mechanisms. Now we can seize offshore funds and bank accounts. We can investigate further. We can hold people in places like Guantanamo Bay without charge for much longer and employ techniques to extract information. Power, money, influence, and control. Getting back to that notion that we all like to think our governments are all benevolent and look after us, and that there are not shady aspects of the deep state and our intelligence agencies. And I can see from your response, you know what I'm talking about. These people will murder their civilians and have done throughout history. You only have to look at the statistics of nations that have disarmed their populations and then murdered them in their millions. Governments act with the lack of transparency, with the most heinous acts that civilian populations feel the brunt of. The COVID lockdowns alone was a draconian implementation that caused catastrophic damage. And you can debate back and forwards about what we needed to do and why we did it, but anyone who, I'll just sort of summarize it. So anyone who thinks that their governments will not act in a manner that could be very, shall we say, detrimental to our well-being is deluding themselves. You should never trust your government. And at least America has a constitutional right to be able to stand up and say, we're not going to let you. I mean, you have to look at things like the Bundy Ranch standoff, Ruby Ridge, some of the very interesting aspects of the Waco siege and the Oklahoma bombings, and that there are people who are recognizing the deep state. Your country, I love America, and I've been there a couple of times.
Just to correct you, Paul, I am not American. I am part of the Commonwealth too. I'm Canadian, so I know what it is. I know.
Apologies.
I know. So no, that's all right. That's all right. I know exactly what you mean about the privilege of having weapons and guns. It's a privilege, and Canada is starting to tighten up the restrictions on that now as well. The U.S. has a constitution, whereas Canada, we have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that is about it. But it's not. There's a notwithstanding clause that still can wipe it all away, and it's happening. It's like little bit by little bit. It's people are bowing down to the tyranny for this false sense of security. It's like, yes, take my freedoms, take whatever you want. So please make me be safe. Please make me be safe. And it's just this constant barrage of fear on the news, and the government just keeps taking and taking. And then a big event comes and the government takes a lot, and then they give back a little bit. They give back just a little bit, so that you're like, oh, okay, things are great. Things are great. Our government is so good. And then it just keeps repeating, and it's more and more. And I think it's like this implementation, the soft, maybe not even soft, but soft implementation of a monarchy. That's what we're headed for. We're all servants, wanting to be ruled. Well, I'm not saying I want to be ruled, but there's so many people that just want to serve under a king. And it's funny, these protests that are happening in the U.S., these no kings. I'm like, are you kidding me? Do you not see what is happening? You guys are all falling for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge philosophical debate. And firstly, I'll say, and it's going to sting a little bit for some people, if you're from Canada, my commiserations. What's going on over there is horrendous. I'm not a fan of Trudeau and the government there, and some of their, the trucking protests for a start, where people wanted to donate to those protests, and the government froze their bank accounts. I mean, this is legitimate protest, and you're able to freeze people's bank accounts. People are being, of course, jailed for the most ridiculous things, whether they post on social media or say something, mispronounce someone's gender. People are being jailed. The Commonwealth particularly seems to have a problem with this implementation of these government shills, these leaders that are running some kind of agenda for a horrendous new world order. And they are stripping the rights away from their civilian populations piecemeal. We have rights. We ostensibly have a constitution and a Bill of Rights here, but we have no rights of freedom of speech here. We have somebody brought in legislation called 18C in Australia, which makes it an offence to offend somebody. So if you say something or do something that offends someone, you can be charged. And, all the comedians are making jokes and saying, well, boy bands offend me. And, okay, you said something that offended me and I got leprosy. It's like, if you get offended, get over it. But you can't legislate to criminally charge somebody if they offend you. And we know what's going on all over the world, particularly in the States. And, yeah, you and I both know that all of this division, black against white, left against straight, trans against, heterosexual, it's all engineered. It's the oldest trick in the book: divide and conquer. Get us fighting each other.
Divide.
Yes, and then we're not looking at the real perpetrators of the oppression of mankind. We know who they are. Very powerful groups. We've talked about them. The likes of Soros and the World Economic Forum, Charles Schwab and Bill Gates, and the power players, the 28 families, the Rockefellers and Rothschilds that rule the world, and they buy and sell countries. They own governments. They end and start wars. They crash economies. And these are the people that are basically just recognizing that we're just this big mass. Let's just get them fighting each other, and let's orchestrate events that will just put the world control under our firm grip. They will implement, agendas to be able to further their own needs. It's, you can argue it all you like, but the New World Order, the Great Reset, which is now no longer conspiracy, is a fact. The United Nations is a vanguard for that. And there are some very evil people that are running the show. And it distresses me a lot that we're fighting each other instead of just being reasoned, civil, decorum, questioning events, holding our governments to account, standing up for our rights. We need to get our guts back, and we need to stand up and fight. It's starting to happen. You can see it in Europe and the UK. My country is very slow to wake up. Canada, I think, needs to wake up as well.
I left Canada. I left Canada during COVID, and it was because one of the reasons was it's failed. I saw it failing, and I have some good friends back there, and I was fighting the fight as well. I was out there protesting, and but it was I got to the point where I'm like, I don't feel safe here anymore. I feel like it's fallen. This isn't the Canada that I grew up in. This isn't the one that when I was a little boy, and don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the politicians were great when I was young. They're all corrupted, but it was better then. And it is getting worse and worse, and people are just willing to accept it, and they will call it, there's the hotline. They're going to call you in for, oh, you got some people in your house that shouldn't be in your house, and of course I was having people in my house when I shouldn't have been. That was my right to fight that tyranny. It was like, yeah, I'm having people over. I don't care if it's a lockdown. This is what's happening because that's my right to fight tyranny. That's my duty.
We had the longest lockdowns in the world in Victoria. 2 years we were locked down under Premier Daniel Andrews. I have never seen more jackboot draconian policing. They were forcing masks on people, arresting pregnant women in front of their families because of Facebook posts where they were trying to organise protests. We had riot police marching through, a community market, ensuring that people were, we had helicopters patrolling open air parks, from the air, making sure that it was, I will never, ever, I never want to see that ever again in our country. And I know that if they try lockdowns again here, people will turn around and say no. The catastrophic result, broken homes, lost businesses, increased domestic violence, suicide, sexual abuse, mental health issues, and of course the side effects from the vaccines themselves. That the toll of that was far greater than the benevolent notion of the. We know that governments like to implement the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution. Oh, there's a problem. We'll scare the population. The population are frightened. Don't worry, the government has a solution. Lock you down, force you to wear masks. I am unvaccinated. It'll be a cold day in hell before I put that vaccine in me. I don't have a problem with vaccinations, provided they go through the 10-year process of being tested. Thalidomide, anyone? And I never wore a mask as well.
Actually, there is so many more like that. That's a whole other bag of worms.
Yeah.
That I highly recommend watching Del Bigtree about that, because I will never touch a vaccine ever again in my life. After actually looking into them and seeing that none are properly safety tested, zero are tested against a placebo. There is no double-blind placebo studies done with any of the vaccines. And some of the vaccines, what they're tested against is another vaccine. So if this original vaccine has a lot of, let's say, reactions, then this one, if it has a lot of reactions, it cancels out. So this is something I think everybody needs to look into. It's not, and I applaud people for saying no to COVID, but I say start looking at those other ones as well. And you were saying that if the lockdowns happen again, you think that Australia will fight it. Unfortunately, I don't think Canada will. I think most of Canada will take it. I know, like I said, I got a lot of good friends back in Canada who will fight it. But unfortunately, I believe the majority is more than happy to bend the knee.
That's the saddest aspect. It's, I don't like to denigrate the mass populations, but people will generally just comply. They'll go along with, and it's sad because, in relation to what you're saying about big pharma, I'm med free now. I don't take anything. I don't even take Panadol. I've got pains and aches and so on. No, I'm going to find alternate sources, hopefully, that will be effective for anything. But you're right. Big pharma makes billions of dollars keeping us sick, not making us healthy. And I see people on that merry-go-round of take this and then that's extrapolated that, so you better take that, which will then alleviate that, and then you got to go back to that. And they're just bouncing up and down like a seesaw. And people who reach the later years of their life and they have an abacus full of tray of pills and they're taking not this little black duck. It's just, I want to be able to trust the powers that be. Of course, we want to know that our needs are looked after, but unfortunately, I don't feel that way. And I feel that we're just rolling over and just taking it, and it's to our detriment. Very sad.
I agree totally, Paul, with you. I agree totally with you. I want to trust, but I think from the track record, we have to know that, it's not, it's something we can't do. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And so never again, never I will trust, that's just the way it goes. So Paul, I want to thank you so much for spending the time and coming on here and, just delivering all these facts, because that's what it is. You're giving the facts. There's, you put a little bit of a speculation because you have to speculate a little bit, but you are giving eyewitness reports. You're giving all these coincidences that aren't coincidences when you have so many. It's synchronicities. There's something fishy that is going on, and it's leading us down a path that I don't want to go. I think that we all need to realize that these aren't isolated events. Though they look isolated, there's a lot of hallmarks and trademarks of other events that have happened throughout the world. So it's not just the US this is happening. That's not just, like in Mexico or Canada or the UK. This is happening throughout the world, and we need to realize that this is coming from a playbook, and we have to be aware and vigilant. And we have to stand up against this tyranny. So, Paul, thank you so much. If you can give a shout out one more time to where everybody can find you, that would be fantastic.
My channel is called The Wasp Files on YouTube. And not only is it an ongoing film podcast exploring all of these aspects of Port Arthur, but there's links to what I will be creating, the largest resource library on Port Arthur. The witness statements, the facts, the evidence, and look, you make your own minds up. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to explore, to educate what you don't know about things. And it's up to you. I often say to people, have at me. I welcome my detractors as well as I invite my supporters. Debate. Use decorum, civility, reason, logic, rationale by all means. And passion is good too. But do your research into everything, whether it's 9/11, COVID, Port Arthur. Do your research before you spout off, and don't just trust what your government and media spew out to you because, not to put too fine a point on it, they are full of crap.
I could not agree anymore, Paul. And so again, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And if you could just hang it on the green room while I do my outro, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks again.
All right, everyone. That was Paul. And he has done a ton of research, on the Port Arthur Massacre. It is imperative that we look into everything, even if this is something that I wasn't aware of until recently. We're talking like maybe 2-3 months ago. And I started to slowly look into it, and so many things don't add up. That one is like extremely, so many things just don't line up on that one. It's easy to tell that this wasn't, the story that they're giving us is not what it truly is. There's other shootings that are happening. Take for instance the Charlie Kirk, one as well. Things aren't lining up, but it seems to be a little bit smoother, And he was talking about the video recorder. They had a video recorder recording that. And if we go to, again, let's just say Charlie Kirk, didn't we just see someone taking the SD card out of a video camera that would, positively identify exactly what happened? And now we don't see that at all. This is ridiculous. There's so many things that are happening. We all have to pay attention. And, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, has to be the truth. Arkham's Razor states that, that the simplest explanation for a phenomenon is most likely to be correct. Hopefully, unless those facts don't line up and they don't actually do it justice. You need to look into this. And like Paul said, question me. That is important. Don't believe me. Look into it for yourself. That's the issue, is that people just want, I'm just going to listen to you and believe you. No. You have to look into, that's what got us to where we are. That is, believing the media. We all thought we could trust the news, but lo and behold, it has taken us down this road of where they're dictating what we think, where they're telling us what we think, just trust the science. It's only a lone gunman. There's nothing else to see here. Building 7 just fell, because of office fires. None of that is real. Okay. You need to start looking for yourself. And until then, keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always find your way back home.
Beneath the stars where shadows grow, the Nephilim's echoes whisper low. Bigfoot roams through the forest deep, and Dogman prowls where the brave won't sleep. Across lost history we wonder why, seeking the truth that time tried to hide. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks, in the void of secrets a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks, in the void of secrets a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Legends rise from the Earth's deep core, a lost legacy we can't ignore. With every step, the veil grows thin, revealing worlds where the strange begins. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back.